Hello and welcome to Top Story. Intrigue is swirling in the West African nation of Guinea after an assassination attempt on the country's military ruler. Conflicting reports are emerging on the health of Musa Dadis Camara. He was apparently shot by an aide whom Camara was about to denounce as the key figure behind a recent massacre. At least 150 people are believed to have died when troops opened fire on civilians in a stadium on September the 28th. Camara has been receiving medical treatment in Morocco. Well, to try to make sense of this story, I'm joined by Professor Douglas Yates, a specialist in African politics at the American University of Paris. Good morning. Who is this figure supposedly behind the shooting, Mr. Diakité?
Well, in Guinea, they call him Lieutenant Toombs, and he was one of the young officers who came to power in the junta. So he was largely unknown before coming to power. But there were interviews with him in the press where he described his own background. He was trained as a medic. He served as a medic in the Rangers. And then he was one of the soldiers who sided with Dadis when they drew straws to see who would be president.
So now he wants to get the straw himself, it seems.
Well, it was rather he wanted to protect himself, and he had something more than a straw. So
he did indeed.
The idea was that he was going to be accused and put up and sort of sacrificed to the international community as responsible for the massacre on September 28th.
So that Dadis Camara could survive.
That's right. Dadis Camara is operating under his story. His defense is that he didn't give the orders, he didn't have knowledge, he was asleep, he didn't want this to happen, he had warned members of civil society, and that's his official story. But according to the Treaty of Rome, he can be held responsible.
Simply because he's the political leader?
That's right.
And the military, because he has both hats, in fact.
That's right. For crimes against humanity, you don't have to prove specific knowledge of the events. You simply, if you have a chain of command, can go all the way to the top, which in Guinea is captain.
Douglas, obviously trying to guess what's happening inside the Guinean junta is a bit like Kremlinology, but what's your analysis of the power of the power struggle there?
Well, this is what we call a Praetorian regime, and that means rather than being an organized, single, unified military force, it's a coterie of armed factions, each supporting different camps. So Dadis represents one group, and he has a lot of support within his own faction. But there's another group, and it's around the person of the Minister of Defense, Sekouba Konaté, who had been Dadis's chief officer in Camp Alpha Jallo. That is, he had been the chief officer of the paratroopers. He was expected by many to be the person to have taken control. He apparently lost on the draw. He wasn't involved in the massacre of September 28th, and he has very strong support, and right now he's the acting leader of the country.
Obviously a powerful figure as he's the defense minister and acting president. So do you think this is now time for his faction to rule Guinea? Was that premature?
That's right, because Dadis not only is losing internal support, but also he's been targeted now in the international community in a way Konaté hasn't. So while Dadis is nursing his head wound in Morocco, it's possible that Konaté is right now consolidating his power.
It's pretty depressing, I mean, that these factions have always been at loggerheads, and as a result Guinea is chronically unstable. I mean, that's been the reality for many years, hasn't it?
Yeah, the failure of nation building is the problem behind many of the civil wars in Africa, and many people are afraid that Guinea might break into civil war. The failure of two principal institutions, one, the democratic institutions, Guinea was ruled by a long time by a single party, and the other, the failure of the military institutions. This failure went back even to the rule of Lansana Conté, and it has an ethnic dimension.
Oh, really? What is that?
Well, Guinea is broken up into many different ethnic groups, but the largest group, the Fulani, are people who are spread throughout West Africa. They're not a majority in any country, but in Guinea they represent the plurality, and much of the politics of the last 50 years has been keeping them out of power. The founding father of Guinea, Sékou Touré, was a Malinké. This is the second largest ethnic group. Lansana Conté was a Susu. This is the third largest ethnic group. But there's 10% of the population made of small ethnic groups from which Captain Dadis and many of the soldiers of this regime come. They're called the forest people. His particular ethnicity is called the Gez, and those people right now are being trained, reportedly by South African and Israeli mercenaries, into an armed militia, a true Praetorian Guard.
But you're not suggesting that the main ethnic group now wants more representation in the army?
No, in fact, they're well represented in the army. The question is rather the representation in the officer corps, and more particularly the pull. If you had a multi-party democracy and parties had organized around ethnic lines, the pull would have controlled the government because they're the largest group. But instead, the 30 different political parties that make up the opposition at this moment have identities that are non-ethnic. The pull have not organized themselves ethnically, so what they have is a defensive reaction against attacks. There are long-term perceptions that the pull had come in the 15th century, that they had pushed down, that they were puppets of the French, and so the Malinke people and the Susu people both, in a sense, have an identity that's anti-pull, and so far that's the ethnic tension.
Right, so it's not so much within the officer corps then?
No, within the officer corps that's ruling, in fact, you have a large number of people who come from these much smaller groups. The perception at first was, well, at least they're not pull. But as we're seeing, the ethnic card, particularly as it gets played, is not turning into large camps of ethnicities fighting each other, but rather ethnic loyalties working through the filter of a patrimonial regime.
So there's no risk of a civil war along ethnic lines like what nearly happened in Kenya, for example?
Well, right. Three possible outcomes out of all of the many outcomes are: one, civil war, ethnic civil war, something like happened in Sierra Leone or Liberia. That's a fear of the international community. I think it's the least likely outcome. The second least likely outcome is true multi-party democracy, in part because civil society and political parties have not managed to surround a single candidate. So the most likely outcome, at least in the short term, is personal rule, and that is a consolidation by one of the military camps over the others. And with the arrest of Jakite, it looks like we're beginning to move in that direction.
So history hasn't moved on because obviously under Sékou Touré, the Marxist dictator, then his successor Lansana Conté, the system was also based on personal rule because the other alternatives you sketched out were not viable.
That's right. Because he failed to develop true multi-party democracy, right now, as they begin to open the floodgates to having true elections, there's no organized opposition political party that has the legitimacy or the credibility to take power. The long one-party rule, and particularly personal rule of a single man, means after they leave, the flood.
So no transition to a civilian government in any meaningful sense?
Well, yes, and that's the direction the international community is pushing towards. But the question is, once you have designated a victor in an election, if you haven't consolidated civil society and if you haven't consolidated the different opposition parties, then those elections will be contested and the new multi-party democracy will collapse, probably to military rule.
Thank you so much for your analysis. Douglas Yates from the American University of Paris, and that's all for this edition of Top Story. Thanks for watching.